And I'd like to introduce our speakers. Emily O'Neill, Technical Services Manager for Deschutes Public Library in Bend, Oregon. Rachel Fischer, Member Services Librarian for Technical Services, CCS in Illinois. And Scott Brandwein, Bibliographic Services Manager for SWAN Library Services, also in Illinois. And I believe our first speaker is going to be Emily. We're all set.
Thank you. Okay. Well, hi, everyone. I do think I might be the only one that it's morning, so I will say good afternoon to everyone. And I'm just excited to be here. So, and thank you for the warm welcome and introduction, Caitlin. So as Caitlin mentioned, my name's Emily O'Neill, and I work as the Technical Services Manager at Deschutes Public Library in Bend. Just to acknowledge the land that I am on today, Bend, Oregon is on the traditional homelands of the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, in particular, their Northern Paiute peoples. So let's get started. My library has been working on a pretty significant initiative to overhaul the Library of Congress subject headings in our catalog. And it started initially with the bias that we know already exists within the Library of Congress subject heading. So specifically, we are aware of, the illegal aliens, the fact that our Native populations are called Indians throughout the entire Library of Congress subject headings. And then, of course, other examples could be, mixed race peoples. There's a lot of subject headings that are dated. Is the, long and short of that is that there are subject headings that really don't fit our current society and our current norm and the words and sensitivities that we are adapting to and growing more accustomed to. And Library of Congress takes a while to update. And so there, for me, felt like there had to be a solution outside of waiting for the Library of Congress to update these kind of archaic, out of date terms. So we took on an initiative to find alternatives, and our alternative vocabularies available to us, there's a lot of them, right? There's probably dozens, if not more than that, various other vocabularies out there that we could choose from that are not the Library of Congress subject headings. And so the first thing that we did was talk about what other vocabularies exist. And the one that we ended up landing on most exclusively was Eric. And I'll talk about Eric a little bit more in the next slide. But beyond just looking at the headings themselves, you have to, in some ways, narrow your scope, right? Within the Library of Congress, there's obviously tens of thousands of subject headings, and how do you even find them? So, I started off with mentioning, of course, there's illegal aliens and Indians of North America, but how would you find anything else in this vast pool of subject headings that could also be considered insensitive? And so we decided to also focus our search for Library of Congress subject headings based off of the government protected classes. So those are race, color, religion, national origin, age, sex, disability, and then we also added additional areas of focus, which include, sexual orientation, familial status, veteran status, genetic information, and pregnancy. So as we went through and we found our new vocabulary, which is Eric, and we decided to focus our search, which is on the government classes, we now had to align what Eric has with what the Library of Congress subject headings have. So let's take a quick minute to give a few details about Eric. So ERIC is a database actually of scholarly and education materials. So you can go in there and find peer-reviewed articles and journal entries really specifically about education and how to teach in a modern society. And actually ERIC itself stands for Education Resources Information Centers, but it is also contains a full vocabulary and thesaurus of 11,000 terms, total items with 4,000 descriptors and 7,000 synonyms. So it is an actual vocabulary that you can go in and use and find, alternatives to the Library of Congress subject headings. And if you actually go to eric.gov or eric.ed.gov and you just click on the thesaurus, you get the full thesaurus, which is the screenshot that we're looking at here. When you click on the browse by category, it says, for example, under B, you see bias and equity. It gives the full list of different terms that fall under that bias and equity umbrella heading. And then you can match the ERIC heading to what would be an insensitive term on the Library of Congress subject headings. And actually, I think I am going to take a quick moment to show that screenshot really fast, if I can figure out how to change my screen share. So let's just take a quick look at that. So here's the actual web page of ERIC. And again, if you click into bias and equity, and then I'm actually going to choose economically disadvantaged, you can see it gives you broader terms, which is, disadvantaged, related terms, but also use this term instead, right? So we see the term poor, and I know that there's a Library of Congress subject heading of poor. And so that gives me a link where I can say, do I prefer the word poor or do I prefer the word economically disadvantaged? And is that something that I feel should be updated in our ILS? So let me go back to my slides. So once we created this map of terms, then we have to update them, right? So we also realized that not everything that is needing to be updated is a Library of Congress subject heading, but it could just be that Library of Congress never actually made a subject heading for that need to begin with. So for example, there is no Library of Congress subject heading for BIPOC or LCG, there is no Library of Congress subject heading for BIPOC. There is no Library of Congress subject heading for LGBTQ people, but we know that people are searching for that in our catalog. So right now, before we made the change, if somebody was searching for BIPOC in the catalog, you would get 0 results. And it was also important for us to realize that, yes, the vocabularies are there so that we have common language and common knowledge and common search capabilities, but we also have the ability to create our own subject headings based off of our users' needs. Of course, Mark gives us the Mark ability to put in a local subject heading for that exact purpose. And so we did go through and also identify terms that we knew our users were looking for, but that we weren't finding an alternative vocabulary to use. With all of that, we made a map. So it looks a little something like this. So on the first column is the Library of Congress subject heading that we have identified as being insensitive or in some way needing to be updated. The next column are the items that we would add additional search, an additional subject heading for better searchability. So for example, those first 2 columns or rows, for sexual minorities and homosexuality, we did add LGBTQ people, which is in fact an ERIC term, just creating better searchability for those materials in our catalog. We also identified certain terms that we decided were so insensitive that we didn't want them represented anymore in our catalog. So for the next section, that working poor, we decided working poor was insensitive enough that we were willing to remove the access of that search capability and instead replace working poor with those 4 subject headings from Eric, which low income group, economically disadvantaged, low income, and poverty. All in, our map ended up being over 300 items long. And I know one of the big questions is, can you share your map? Yes, that's coming on another slide. So we will get to that. So that's all fine in D&D, but now how do you actually get it updated? So there were 3 main options that we talked about as far as getting the map adjusted into our actual ILS. The first one is in-house cataloger work using global update functionality within your ILS. We are in Sierra, which means that we have a lot of global update functionality, but not all ILSs have that. And the other part of that is that it works when you have maybe 1 or 2 subject headings that you're needing to update regularly. But as I just mentioned, our map ended up being over 300 items, which was just not going to be feasible for us to put that amount of workload onto our individual cataloging department. The next option we investigated was load profiles. So certain ILSs can make changes to records when you load them into the system, which again works well if it's only 1 or 2 items. So if you're changing just, the illegal aliens or 1, maybe additional subject heading, then that might work. But again, with a map of like 300, it just ended up being overwhelming for that load profile to be able to make that adjustment. So then the third option is we thought about our authority control vendors. So our authority vendors do a number of bibliographic updates already, right? So as you go from AACR2 to RDA, they are making sure that all of your records are RDA, or they'll standardize your ISBNs. And so it occurred to me that maybe we could ask our authority vendors if we could give them our map, would they be able to make the updates for us when we do quarterly authority updates? And as it turns out, the answer was yes. So huge shout out to Backstage Library Works. They've been a massive partner to us in making this possible. But that's exactly what happened, is that we identified out of our list what of the items were 100% of the time when this subject heading exists, replace it with our new term or add our additional term. And it did have to be a 100% of the time scenario, because essentially they're making an algorithm and a profile for us and running our records through computer software to make those changes. It's not done by a person or an individual, but really a profile that has been created for us. And so we had to go through our map line at a time and make sure that we were really comfortable with a 100% of the time when this occurs, do this. And it was done magically with Backstage's help. So I'm going to give a couple examples of what it looks like. So I mentioned a little bit earlier, BIPOC is not a Library of Congress subject heading. If you had a user that was looking specifically for that term prior to our change, they would have gotten 0 results. There was not a single title that was going to come up with a keyword of BIPOC. But with the addition of that local subject heading, we now have, 4,000, well, at the time of the screenshot, about 4,600 items that now have that search result for that user. But what makes this even more exciting is that because it is a keyword search, we can now filter on the side by audience and format. So for example, if you wanted to reduce this search result of 4,000 down to just, teens books, teens fiction, you would get a search result of basically protagonists, most likely, that have BIPOC characteristics. And now somebody gets to have books that either represent themselves, which I know is an awesome search capability that often our users are looking for, is how do I find books that I feel culturally represented in? Or alternatively, the concept of mirrors and doors, opening up that door to a different culture of your own and maybe help you get to know your society a little bit better. And just a little screenshot on the side, we did have a number of partnerships as we went through the process. So here in Central Oregon, there's an organization called the Central Oregon Black Leaders Assembly. And we did reach out to that organization as we were picking out our terms. And I let him know when this happened, when this work finally got into place. And he actually posted about it on his Facebook page with enthusiasm and a lot of positive feedback from that group that they felt represented in the library collection. So I mentioned a moment ago that you want to make sure that it's a 100% of the time with the mapping that you would send to an authority vendor if you go that route. And that's because, again, it isn't a human being that is making those changes for you. It's a profile through that authority vendor. And so if there is gray area, then you're going to have that assigned to your cataloging group. And we do actually have a separate spreadsheet that's really more about that gray area that our cataloging team takes a look at periodically. The other part is, as we assign this or that, you want to be aware of the weights of the terms. So for example, with the example I gave a little bit earlier of the working poor and moving it to low income, that is a little bit on the lines of the same term, but you wouldn't necessarily want to say, you could add the broader term, right? So of economic status, right? Because low income is an economic status. And so you can add that broader term, which would add an additional searchability to that topic and concept. Or, but what you can't do is if you see economic status, you can't just automatically add poverty or low income. So being aware of the broader and narrower as you make those maps. And the last thing, and I mentioned it before, there were certain terms that were removed, and we didn't remove very often. Most of the time, we wanted to just add better searchability, better accessibility, making sure that certain concepts were more easily discovered. But there were certain times that terms were so insensitive that we made the decision to remove them. But when you do remove them, you are removing that access point. And so there's a little bit of a weight there of knowing if somebody uses that term that you've now removed, they're going to lose access, searchability access, and may need some help with updating the terms they're using to find the materials that they're looking for. But like I said, we weren't done. So we added to this project after the first wave of creating the map and getting it implemented through Backstage. We realized that there was a lot of interest in organizations to see our map. So we decided to make that openly available, and I'll show you that now. We also realized that there are other vocabularies out there that may be of interest for us to add. Specifically, Homosaurus vocabulary has been gaining a lot of traction. And so we worked through a process to also add Homosaurus. And then the last, which I mentioned at the very start of the Indians of North America, that one's a little bit more challenging because many of our native tribes are broken out into their own subject headings as well. And so it isn't just one or two subject headings, it's several hundred, maybe even thousands that you need to go through and update. So we had a project for that as well. So the first is open access to our maps. So as I mentioned, this is just a Google Sheets that we have open and available to anyone. This was created through the Oregon Library Association Technical Services Roundtable. As an initiative, we decided that Deschutes, yes, has done a lot of work on this project, but a lot of other Oregon libraries had as well. And some of the decisions that we made locally for ourselves maybe aren't the same decisions that other institutions made or will make. And so it was a way for us to crowdsource all of the different changes that are happening across Oregon, both to see what options you have available, but also the intention was to maybe allow some support to organizations that were not getting the initial response to support that they had hoped, being able to say, hey, look at all of these libraries that are doing it. I will admit that after the initial wave of contribution to this open source sheet, we haven't gotten a lot of additional contributions, but it is openly available for anybody to view. The next initiative was the removal of American Indians in North America. So again, this also came from our partnership with Backstage. And this really is, I cannot take any credit for this other than, having a really good partnership with the vendors that you use in your library to help, better your catalog. So Backstage went through the arduous practice of finding all of the subject headings that were related to our native populations. And their plan was to update everything to Indigenous peoples of North America, which we are open and accepting of. We also had additional conversations with our local tribes and asked them what language they preferred to be represented by. And they told us that they actually preferred the terminology Native Americans. And so we did accept the changes from Backstage on the Indigenous people of North America, while also again adding local subject headings for Native Americans. And then another example here, just the very first one, when Backstage went through trying to identify the individual tribes, this particular book is about the Dakota peoples, and you can see that first subject heading. The Library of Congress subject heading on that is Dakota Indians, and rather than retain Indians anywhere in this record, that was just updated to Dakota people. And this book in particular was of interest to us because it was our community read last year. So it was really nice to be able to have those subject headings updated and having that cultural sensitivity with a book that we knew was going to be widely read and received across our community. We also did have an initiative also partnered with Backstage to include all of the Homosaurus vocabulary throughout our entire catalog. So lots of good partnerships with that vendor. And because of that, this is a flyer that we had. This is part of their advertisement of their scope of work and the different services they can provide. And it kind of goes into the full extent of the materials and records that were updated. Through the entire initiative of records, something along the lines of like 20% of our library catalog was updated with all of the different terms and initiatives that we partnered with them about. Which leads me to my last thought, which is why did we do all this? Why are we here? And it's just a reminder that the catalog is an extension of your library. and it is a part of your brand, and the words and terms that you use represent you. So it's important that you can stand behind the words in your catalog just as much as you can stand behind the words at your service desks, on your strategic plan, in your vision, mission, and values. They should all be in an alignment. And that is it for me. Thank you so much. Casey Cheney is our contact at Backstage. So I included her here because I know she would be more than happy to share her portions of what happened on the Backstage partnership. And thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rachel Fischer. I'm the Member Services Librarian for Technical Services at Cooperative Computer Services, or CCS. It's a public library consortium in Northern Illinois, in the northern and northwestern suburbs of the Chicago area. So in 2020, CCS decided to thoroughly research metadata for diversity, equity, and inclusion so that the topic could be brought to the advisory and technical groups for approval and inclusion in the CCS database. By the end of 2021, 3 important motions were passed. These included replacing Library of Congress subject heading, or LCSH, terms for illegal aliens with the headings recommended by the ELECT's Subject Analysis Committee, or SAC's working group report on alternatives to illegal aliens. And we also allowed the homosaurus terms for LGBTQ plus topics in the CCS database from homosaurus as a supplementary controlled vocabulary to LCSH, and then also allowed an additional controlled vocabulary for Spanish language materials. Since Library of Congress decided to update the illegal aliens headings with illegal immigration and non-citizens headings, CCS has decided to continue to use the local headings that it previously chose. In order to get the buy-in necessary for passing motions, I conducted a significant amount of research and presented that research to the advisory and technical groups before the group voted. This presentation will provide an overview of the research and decision-making process in order to pass the motions. So after deciding which headings needed replacing or supplementing by other headings, the first step is to research all options. So this includes identifying alternative controlled vocabularies. In the case of immigration headings, we utilized the list that was already created by the SAC working group. So I placed all of those headings and the various different options for replacement headings from different controlled vocabularies like Sears and Mesher-Eric and ASCL into an Excel file to compare them and identify the options that were most commonly used. To identify all possible LGBTQIA+ controlled vocabularies, I utilized the list of Library of Congress approved source codes for subject headings. This includes all of the different controlled vocabularies that you could use in OCLC, like foreign language headings. Some are career focused and others are for specific ethnic groups or medical terms. And I compared the different options to find out which were the most accessible and which were in use by other libraries. So regarding the LGBTQIA+ terms, there are 2 that are freely available online. homosaurus is more widely used by public libraries and academic libraries. The gender, sex, and sexual orientation, or GSSO ontology, is more geared towards a scientific or medical library and does cite homosaurus. So homosaurus really seemed like it was the best option for libraries to use. But some libraries also do like using local subject headings. So an important step in demonstrating how beneficial alternative vocabularies are is to run reports on the searches that patrons actually use in your catalog. So there is a lot of data that I've crammed onto this slide, both illegal alien replacements and LGBTQ terms, but I've highlighted just a couple of terms in red. And you can see that in this report, these are the ones that are most frequently used. So the term undocumented on its own, as well as immigrants and immigration, were the most widely searched with terms for immigration topics. And I just highlighted a couple from homosaurus. For example, queer and non-binary were more frequently searched with than sexual minorities or gender non-conforming people. Another great research project that I did was to test how the usage of specific search terms impacts a user's experience. So to do so, I identified the total number of records with the specific Library of Congress subject heading. So in this case, at the time it was illegal aliens, and that was 536 records that had that term in it. And then I searched for the various different alternatives that could replace it, like unauthorized immigration, unauthorized immigrants, undocumented immigrants, and undocumented migrants. So I calculated the percentage of the records that were retrieved out of the total number of records that had illegal aliens in it. So this is similar to a concept called a recall ratio, but I didn't calculate it exactly as the same as a recall ratio because I just used the total number of records that appeared and didn't look at each one to make sure it was relevant. Normally, a recall ratio looks at each record to make sure it's relevant or not, because there could be some non-relevant records that are just on immigrants, but not undocumented immigrants that could appear. So it made it apparent that undocumented immigrants brought up more records than the other options. And that 17% of the records that could have illegal aliens in it were appearing in the catalog. So it definitely seemed to be the better option. So after conducting all of that research, it's important to pull it all together into a presentation to demonstrate the value of making the decision. So this presentation should include tables of the statistics, like the ones I showed you today, that prove that the search terms that we would select would be beneficial for the patrons to use or the students. And you can also include examples of specific books or DVDs that would benefit from the addition of these search terms. So this is an image of a slide that I used as an example for the term non-binary people in homosaurus. So in this slide, I pointed out that the term that is used in Library of Congress subject headings, such as gender nonconformity and gender nonconforming people, is not actually the currently preferred term for non-binary people, and that gender nonconformity depicts a bias that adheres to gender stereotypes of a binary gender system. And also pointed out that non-binary is a term that most patrons are using to search for titles when they're not just searching for the title of an existing book. So relevant terms to add to the records would be non-binary people, And if a book specifically states that is related to being assigned female or assigned male at birth, you could also add assigned female or assigned male at birth from Homosaurus. So understanding the process that CCS uses to approve the changes to the cataloging workflow may help you to pass motions at your library or consortium. I'm not familiar with your own decision-making process, so you may have a similar process at your consortium, but I will just review the process that CCS uses. So CCS members all utilize the same cataloging manual for local practices. Any workflow changes, like allowing Homosaurus, need to follow the consortium's decision-making procedures in order to be adopted. The CCS decision-making process consists of 4 tiers. So when it comes to cataloging workflow, an advisory group consisting of 7 members can pass motions to recommend changes. CCS staff can advise the library staff at any point in the process. Then a technical group that consists of members from every library needs to vote on the recommendation to approve the policy. If the policy includes a change to the bibliographic input standards or completely replaces a subject heading from Library of Congress, the officers from the governing board that make up the executive committee need to approve of that change. So any change in the cataloging policy can take 2 or more months to be approved from the time that an issue is brought to an advisory or technical group. So I'm going to provide some examples that are more focused on the Homosaurus process of how we actually discussed and made that decision. Because it was CCS's first time discussing the addition of a new thesaurus and the replacement of LCSH terms, the executive director of CCS wanted to make sure we had director buy-in before pursuing it further. So she brought the issue to the executive committee meeting before I presented on the topics at the advisory and technical groups. So this committee consists of the members of the governing board that are considered officers, as well as members at large that were nominated to the executive committee from the governing board. So in regards to Homosaurus, as I stated, they did approve the process for allowing CCS staff to work with library staff to move forward with allowing any terms from additional thesauri without their approval, as long as it's not replacing the Library of Congress subject heading. So in regards to the issues like replacing illegal aliens with other immigrant-related headings, we did need to get the executive committee approval before replacing those headings. And then we had to bring our suggested replacement headings to the advisory group and technical group to approve the actual replacement terms that the CCS staff recommend. So the approval process for Homosaurus required more presentations than approving the replacements for the immigration headings, because all we had to do for those immigration headings was just get approval for the terms that CCS recommended. So to get approval to allow Homosaurus in the catalog, I presented at the April 2021 Cataloging Advisory Group meeting, which we call that SCRAP, but that stands for Standard Cataloging Rules and Practice. SCRAP members stated their concern about vocabulary terms that contradict LCSH specifically, or had other common meanings. And so this included sexually explicit terms and terms related to animals like bears and cubs, or other words like fairies and Goldilocks. And so at that time, the group was willing to approve a motion to recommend that SCRAP reviews Homosaurus and selects the most appropriate terms for the CCS database. And as of June, though, Homosaurus did add parenthetical qualifiers to terms like bears. So some of these headings are more acceptable now. However, CCS staff at the time discussed the scrap recommendation and had a different opinion. CCS's preference was for the cataloging and metadata management technical group, or CAM, we call that CAM for short, to vote on a motion to allow all of the homosaurus terms in the CCS database. The actual workload required for scrap to regularly review hundreds and potentially thousands in the future, or hundreds of vocabulary would really just take up way too much time over the long run. And so it would just be in their best interest to allow all of the terms. CCS staff were able to run reports comparing all of the homosaurus terms to the search terms that patrons actually use when searching in the catalog to identify the most commonly used terms that could be potentially problematic, and then create a list and add that to the catalog handbook so that we'd be able to provide guidance on how to use the cataloger's judgment when applying terms. So after creating that list, the policy then needed to be brought to the Cataloging and Metadata Management, or CAM, technical group for approval. So this is the group that has members from all libraries that would have to vote, and each library gets one vote to approve a motion. So at the May 2021 technical group meeting, I presented an updated presentation on the topic, which included the advisory group's opinion and the CCS staff opinion. I presented the similar slides as I showed you today that included the statistics and the results of the research, as well as examples of titles that could benefit from homosaurus terms. We also explained that we would be providing guidance in the cataloger's manual, which we call the catalog wiki, that would allow them to apply their cataloger's judgment properly. And because the LGBTQIA+ terms are unfamiliar to many people that are in homosaurus, we plan to provide homosaurus training with a member of the editorial board so that they could learn how to properly utilize the homosaurus website. So this information allowed the motion to pass unanimously. And after the motion passed to allow homosaurus, the cataloging advisory group, which was called SCRAP, and I work on the cataloging handbook pages. So after the page was finalized, it then needed to be approved at the CAM, or Cataloging and Metadata Management Technical Group meeting. So in regards to homosaurus, CCS will be retaining all Library of Congress subject heading terms and will not be replacing them with homosaurus terms. Catalogers will not add any duplicate terms or terms that just have a different word order to Library of Congress subject headings terms. We don't need to add any redundant terms. Homosaurus doesn't actually distinguish between subject and genre headings in their website, but CCS does place genres in the 655, so we continue to do that with the homosaurus genres. And it also includes the full list of terms that they may want to avoid that have other commonly used meanings like types of animals. Although, as I said, this section will need to be updated because as of June, they added parenthetical qualifiers. So if you click on our link that I'll be sending out to you later, you'll see that we haven't updated our handbook yet as of the updates to homosaurus that were completed in June. And we chose to add in a local practice as well. In homosaurus, they actually consider queer to be hierarchically underneath LGBTQ+, and don't consider it to be equivalent umbrella terms. However, we found that because queer has become an important identity term and is frequently searched with, we decided to add in a local practice to add the equivalent queer term with an LGBTQ plus term at the same time in the bibliographic records when the terms exist. However, not all LGBTQ plus and queer terms have equivalent terms. So this is an example of our record when we would add the LGBTQ plus and queer terms simultaneously. This is a book called Never Silent Act Up and My Life in Activism by Peter Staley. It's an autobiography of an AIDS activist. So the record includes the LCSH subject headings for the author's name, the ACT UP organization, AIDS activists, AIDS disease, and the homosaurus term that's added for the subject heading is LGBTQ plus activists. However, there is no equivalent term for queer activists, but we did add the genre headings. So the genre from LCGFT is autobiographies, and the genres from homosaurus are LGBTQ plus biographies, queer biographies, and gay biographies. So while it may seem redundant and have the same meaning to some people, ensuring that we have access for all identities that are searched for is important to enhance access to the records. And here's one example of our one of our records that has the undocumented immigrants headings in it. So this has undocumented immigrants and undocumented immigrant children. And this book is Areli is a Dreamer by Areli Morales. So when deviating from national practices, it's important to get buy-in from the administrators and librarians from all members in a consortium. So I'd like to conclude my presentation with some recommendations for getting buy-in. When planning to present on the topic, it is important to demonstrate how beneficial the new vocabulary is. So this can include examples of statistics, as I showed you, as well as problematic subject headings and specific titles that would benefit from the addition of these terms to their records. You can also add some headings to records and create authority records in your catalog as examples. So you're also welcome to use records from the CCS pack as examples to show how it looks in our catalog. Feel free to search the pack. I've got links in the slides that you can access after the presentation. And there's also links in the slide to the spreadsheet that lists all of the homosaurus terms that we have in the CCS database. So feel free to take some time to look through that list and practice searching for the homosaurus terms in our catalog to see what items have homosaurus terms in it. So right now we have more than 1,000 records that do have homosaurus terms in them that you can search for. And it's also important to explain in your presentations what your cataloging handbook sections will look like. So this could include just an overview of your ideas that won't necessarily be approved yet, to explain how you will provide guidance on how to use the new terms, or you can mock up a full draft of your handbook. And feel free to use the CCS catalog handbook pages that I'll provide links for as examples of cataloging policy that exists at a consortium. And another important point to include is a training plan. It's much easier to get buy-in if you can ensure that all the librarians will be trained in how to use the vocabulary, especially if you are going to be using it manually And at our library, at our consortium, we actually have not asked for assistance from a vendor to update our records. So we do have a data services librarian that helps to update the immigration headings that aren't being updated by the library staff, but everyone is responsible for adding in the headings themselves as they see records appear. So this presentation basically touched on all of the bases that should be helpful for providing a thorough enough amount of information in a presentation to educate the decision makers at your libraries and consortium on their recommended subject headings in a manner that will make it easy enough to understand and be able to hopefully gain the support you need to approve new policies at your library or consortium.
All right. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me and see my screen. My name is Scott Brandwein. I am the Bibliographic Services Manager at SWAN Library Services, also in the Chicago area. We are a consortium of 100 member libraries, mostly public. We have a couple of academics, a couple of specials, and a school district in the mix, but we're primarily a public library consortium in a different region of the Chicago suburbs from CCS. And I'm going to talk to you today about an aspect of our DEI project that sort of moves away from the intricacies of cataloging and into some of the issues we ran into when we started our project. So early in 2021 was when our DEI task force was formed. I should say when I formed a DEI task force at the response of a number of our member staff who were interested in undergoing this project and starting to take a look at our subject headings and our catalog data to see, how it fit into this topic. And we got into it, and a few months into the project, we got some feedback from some of the administrators of our member libraries, just with some concerns. And part of that was because our process for, cataloging updates and all of that is not so formal at SWAN as it is, as Rachel was describing with CCS. Our governing board doesn't have any sort of say or even they're not always informed about our cataloging decisions. That's something that we do kind of at the more local level. So let me just get started here. This is called DEI work in a divided community. And so we're going to be talking on just a couple of issues. One, working in a divided community, by which I mean in a community where you have to acknowledge some of the sort of bad actors that have been cropping up in the library community of late. People who are protesting books, inclusion of specific materials in libraries, specific events that they may be. We had recently a drag bingo event at one of our member libraries that was protested. And so just that sort of bubbling, boiling, hot button area. It can be tough, and there's a lot of concern within some of our member libraries of getting pushback from these community members. So this is about working with potential pushback in mind and how to sort of prepare yourself to counter any opposition that might come on. And I started thinking about these things in response to this administrator feedback. So as this says, emotions can run high on topics related to diversity and inclusion. I have a couple of just examples of things that have happened, recent discussion and incidents, both local and national, but these are all things that have happened also in our local communities, which makes them feel extremely personal. An example here again is there was an objection to a mask mandate at one of our local member libraries that made the staff feel very threatened. And so that feels adjacent to all of this sort of diversity talk as well, I think for obvious reasons. And so things you want to take into consideration when you're sort of just wrapping your mind around this is, emotional and physical safety of library staff and library patrons is paramount. And this discussions of, when you are getting protests or this pushback, depending on who your governing board is and how the response is, that things like this can touch funding, can touch hours, and it can touch employment, which of course are all very sensitive issues. So the feedback we got from a couple of our board members, and our board members are made up of directors of our member libraries. First, I should say, they were incredibly supportive of the work that our task force was doing. It wasn't an objection to that on a philosophical level. It was more, they were unfamiliar with metadata work, and so there were some misunderstandings of what our goals actually were. Some of those misconceptions were that we were making recommendations or mandates about materials that our members would purchase, which was not the case. SWAN has never had any say in the collection policies of our member libraries. There was concern that we were removing access points, which has been touched on from our previous two presenters, that is a concern, but it's not the case with the way SWAN was approaching this, and that we were taking things off of shelves. So that's, again, wasn't true. And so I spoke with these library directors just to sort of get their perspective and see what we could do to, assuage some of their concern. And really what it came down to was a call for transparency and to sort of arm them with the tools that they needed to respond to any pushback that they might get from outside. So there's sort of 4 areas I want to talk about when it comes to meeting pushback on a project like this. You're going to want to focus on the way that these projects are promoting access to your collection. It's sort of a positive thing, not a negative, way of removing access points. That's where that sort of locks in here. You want to be really mindful when it comes to who you're promoting your changes to, where the documentation goes, who has visibility into it. With regard to documentation, you want as much, I think, written down as possible so that the whole picture is out there. And you also, there is a place where a situation where you can appeal to your local demographics. So promoting access. One thing that SWAN has absolutely not done, and this was one of our founding principles of our task forces, we're not going to remove access points, even if the terms in question are suspect or slightly offensive. We did mask some from display. So for example, before the Library of Congress made their updates to the illegal aliens heading, we had decided that our preferred term was going to be undocumented immigrants. And so we, incorporated that term into our bibliographic catalog, but we relegated illegal aliens, instead of overwriting it and deleting it, we put it into a custom field that we defined, and it was no longer visible in our OPAC, but it was indexed alongside the subject terms in our OPAC. And we did that sort of in concert with our, at the time, we were using Enterprise Cersei Dynex's Enterprise Discovery Layer for that. And we, so no access was taken away, but the OPAC would sort of gently guide you to the preferred terms that we had agreed upon. So that was good. It was good to say that we've already thought about this, and it's not an issue. We also, as Rachel described, we grounded our decisions also in patron behavior, and that's a way for us to say, we're meeting the community where they are. And that is also a very convincing, and it was very comforting for our administrators to hear that. And we were able to back up a lot of our decisions with user data it's not always possible, but to sort of be able to show that methodology for, at least an example or two, helps to sort of just give the perspective of what you're actually doing. When it came to promoting our changes, this is where we sort of fumbled at first. I'm gonna say, as our task force was making decisions very, very early on, we were writing cataloging documentation. That cataloging documentation was behind a login wall on our support site, and it was sort of buried. It wasn't visible from our main page. It wasn't even in a section of its own. It was sort of buried in the sort of more technical bits of our cataloging documentation when we were talking about like our automated processes and some of the behind the scenes stuff that goes on. And the reason for that was because a lot of our DEI updates we did automate. I'm a pretty good hand with the script, and so a lot of those changes were taking place behind the scenes, and so that's where it fit. But then when our directors came to want to find this information, they A, couldn't find it, and B, when they did find it, it didn't make a lot of sense to them because I sort of wrote it from my perspective rather than the perspective of that they would appreciate. So that's something that, well, I'll talk about that in a moment, but we did overhaul all of our documentation. But the other thing is that, it is technical documentation, it is cataloging documentation, and it did not really need to come to the patron level or the community level. Good data work is invisible to your users. And a lot of the changes we were making, if we were doing our job right, would enhance search results for specific terms, bring up, more results, more relevant results. But really the average patron, unless they're very, very savvy, is not going to see the difference, to be honest, at least not know they're seeing the difference. So you want to just consider who your stakeholders are and who needs to know what, so that those who will want to see this work done can know that you're doing this work, and if they don't, their experience will not be affected in any appreciable way. And so one thing that we have done just recently, like last month, we overhauled all of our documentation. Actually, I'm going to talk about that here. We found that documentation, directors wanted to see documentation, staff wanted to see documentation. And of course, that's a broad range of different levels of knowledge when it comes to the catalog. So we sort of developed our documentation to be kind of funnel down and get more specific. So you can kind of stop when you got what you needed out of it, and you didn't have to necessarily dig into the mark code, all of the scripting and all of that stuff. As if you can check out before you get to that level. But the questions that our administrators, our directors wanted, that we're asking, and they wanted insight into, was what were the changes that were being made, and what is the philosophy behind them, and then they wanted specifics like conversion pathways, supplementary vocabularies, for example, homosaurus, and any changes that were being made to accompanying metadata, which is by which I mean things outside of our subject headings, which is not something we had really explored. So I had to say that. Why we're making these changes. So, we've included a history of our task force, how it was inception, what the inception of it was, which was, it generated from staff requests. They just wanted to get into this work because they were hearing things from patrons. So we talked about that. We have summaries of some of our meetings available in another part of our support site, not necessarily our documentation, but you can go sort of see our minutes, which are very, very spare and casual, but at least they're there. What resource materials we've been consulting, and any precedent, other groups that were doing similar work, helps ground your own work. And so also the how, and this is when I'm getting into the very specifics of process documentation scripts, and any training that's necessary. But for us, we are really taking the onus off of our member catalogers when we're doing this work. So the training is not necessarily a thing that concerns us, but it might if your catalogers need to be aware of these changes in their own day-to-day work. make sure documentation is accessible to all levels. I sort of already talked about that. And the last bit is sort of knowing your own community. I talked already about, meeting your patrons where they are. You can identify where your decisions are doing the most service towards your local demographics. If you have, a large Spanish-speaking population, that might be a place where you want to start. But it also can be a good way to say, listen, these people are why we are doing this. It's this is sort of a patron-first initiative, and bring the people to the forefront of the conversation. And again, use statistics to ground your choices in the community you serve. This refers to, of course, as Rachel was talking about, search statistics and all of that, but you can also talk about your demographic statistics and sort of create a story using both of those things together. And one thing that I mentioned earlier was the idea of grounding the work you're doing in the larger picture of what libraries on the whole are doing. And so that might be a challenge. And it actually was a challenge for us because we heard, you hear talk of other libraries doing DEI projects or this organization or that organization, but it's sort of happening piecemeal everywhere. And it's hard to sort of really say there is a movement taking place. And so one of the things that we did at the beginning of last year was to create that organization ourselves. So at the end of 2021, well, I should say during the middle of 2021, we were recognizing this need for library staff to come together to discuss these issues. I mean, we have 100 libraries and we have 100 libraries worth of staff who just needed somewhere to go. And I wasn't really qualified to be that person. And so we decided to look outside. So Rachel and I, at the beginning, well, I guess I should say at the end of last year, founded a group initially working with one of our regional library systems called Rails. And as we sort of separated from that, but that was where it was grouped at first. And it's called the Illinois DEI and Metadata Networking Group, which we just wanted to bring this conversation to a higher level and get more stakeholders involved. And so what this group is at the moment is sort of an informal group of a number of Illinois library staff who want to be part of this discussion. We have quarterly discussion meetings. We maintain a listserv if in case anybody wants to, just ask a question to the general populace. And this is kind of the best part, we are forming or have formed working groups to research some specific topics. And this really is, for me, the bread and butter of what this group is about. And this is really what I wanted to personally get out of it when we were establishing it a year ago. And so about these working groups a little bit, they are each tasked with performing research and providing sort of a package of best practice recommendations in several topic areas. So the 4 working groups that we have going at the moment are an immigration group, an LGBTQ plus group, a group talking about Native and Indigenous populations, sort of centered in Illinois and the Midwest, but not limited to that. Excuse me, and a group talking about disability and accessibility concerns. And the goal is the creation of shared toolkits, and we're actually looking at some FAQs as well for libraries who want to take on DEI projects and just don't have a place to start. There's a couple of good things that this is speaking towards, and one is, what we kept hearing was people just don't necessarily know what they're doing, which is fine. And so this is sort of just a kickstart. And also, there's no point for all of these libraries all over, in our case, the state, reproducing the same research. So we can sort of put things into a central repository. So it includes links to, and I should say it will. This is definitely currently under construction. It hasn't been really put together yet. We've got sort of a skeleton so far. But links to resources, of course, recommendations, conversion pathways for subject headings, supplementary vocabularies like Homosaurus is something that our LGBTQ plus group is talking about. I'm really excited about the way this is going to turn out. I wish it were further along at this point, so I'd have a little more to show at the moment, but it's definitely on a good track. So there is a lot of power in just bringing people together and getting them in the same room and saying, hey, what do we want to get out of this? And so if there's any room in your current situation to do that, I would encourage you to just go for it. I'm not an expert on this topic area by any means, so it was really just a matter of press and go and seeing where something like this could lead us. So I just wanted to add that sort of tacked on to the end here to let you know about something cool that's going on in Illinois. And that about does it for me. This is the conclusion of the 3 of our presentations, and I suppose we can turn our cameras on and take questions at this point.
Thank you. We did get a few questions earlier during Emily's presentation, so I'll go ahead and start asking those. But if anyone else has any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll make sure those get heard. We're here for another 15 minutes, so we have some time. I also just quickly, before we start with that, Rachel just shared a link to her slides if anyone would like access to those. And I can share a copy of the transcript for anyone that is interested in a copy of that. I also want to put in the chat a link to the evaluation for today. Please fill that out if you have time. First question, Emily, this is about the terms that you replaced. They wanted to know if a C reference was used, SEE.
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing I probably should have mentioned in my presentation is that your decisions will be based off of so many different things, including what ILS and what discovery layer you are on. So we are on BiblioCommons, which actually doesn't read our authority records at all. So those see also references come from typically authority records. And so all of our updates were made entirely in the bibliographic records. With our partnership with Backstage, they did provide authority records for the Homosaurus changes and where applicable, some of our local subject headings, they were able to generate that for us, but it doesn't create any sort of see also link using BiblioCommons. So we would like to, but it's not feasible with the systems that we have.
Great. Another question for you. Someone wanting to know how you built your BIPOC resources list.
Yeah. So I might share my screen again. Let me see if I can find some examples. Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. This is based off of the Library of Congress subject headings. So Library of Congress has, of course, a variety of African-American subject headings. So where we found those, we would go ahead and add a local BIPOC and then also the ERIC of Black people. We did also, to avoid othering where applicable, add white people, so like Caucasian race. So those are terms that we added based off of Library of Congress subject headings that were already in the records.
Great, thank you. One last question that I have from earlier. Someone wanted to know if ERIC is being used in school library presently. I'm not a school librarian, so I'm not the best person to answer that question, but if anyone can elaborate on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I am a public library, so I don't know if schools are using it specifically. that vocabulary you are eligible to use in any ILS that is using MARC format. So you can use it if you would like to. It's available for anybody, but I don't know if it's a standard.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions for our presenters while we still have them? The floor is open.
I can add something for the here I am. I can add something for the school library end. In the library automation end, it's mostly LC children's or Sears. And I work with cataloging records for some of the regions down here, and I have not seen Eric being an option yet. Doesn't mean they're not in there somewhere, but I'll try to keep an eye out. But I do know that what everyone has covered today is what is kind of important, because they are trying to find other ways of access, especially for alternative language considerations for subject headings. So, but that's all that I know. I have not seen Eric at all, unless someone else out there has.
Should put that a link in the chat. It's a link to Eric. So thank you for sharing that, Mary. And thank you, Todd, also for your input. That was really helpful.
Yeah, thank you. While we're waiting for questions, I thought I might show one last thing I had forgotten about when I was presenting before. We talked a lot about like insensitive terms, but our project was both addressing the insensitivities within our catalog, but also a way to better find materials of differing points of view. So a big part of our initiatives were to just add more searchability to the materials that maybe would create those opening doors and opening windows. So for example, and I'll just bring up the map again, we'll see we added, like, for example, Chinese Americans. There's nothing insensitive about that, but we did add Asian Americans to all of the Asian American subject headings that we could find, so that then you can search for that and have that open door. So here's our catalog. And again, you do a catalog search of Asian Americans. Before that wasn't really even an option. I think we got like maybe 30 some odd results. Bibliocommons, again, weights by title. So you're typically going to get videos or books or whatever that specifically are titled Asian Americans. But this is that example of, if you can come over to the format or genre, then you can say, oh, let's go to juvenile fiction. And we have a whole list of those mirrors and doors and windows. So that's really essentially the use case as to why some of those terms are on the list. People will say, well, there's nothing wrong with, saying, drug abuse, for example, but we were adding more searchability to some of those protected classes just for better visibility in our catalog.
That's a great point. Improving the usability, especially because catalogs can be overwhelming for patrons too. So it's a great way to make it easier for them to use. I put our last call for questions, but we did not get any. So I think that means we can wrap it up here. I want to thank Scott, Rachel, and Emily. All of you, thank you so much for your presentations. Great information. I was very excited to learn about Backstage actually doing cataloging services, because I didn't know they provided that. Everyone else, thank you for attending. I really appreciate you spending your afternoon with us, or morning in Emily's case. And we will get you the recording and other materials as soon as I possibly can. Thank you so much for attending. Have a great day. Have a great weekend.